everybody, and welcome to the Empowered CPA podcast. I am your host, Dawn Scott. Today, we are going to talk about pricing. I get asked all the time for help with my clients about how do you value the service you provide, or how do you value the products that you give to the world? What is the gold standard, if you will, for how the heck to figure that out? So we're going to talk about a little bit of the history, kind of how things have been priced historically. We are going to talk a little bit about how inflation and kind of what we're going through right now is really fumbling up our plans, and then kind of walk through the things that I like to talk about with my clients to just consider all of these different things when you're making your pricing. A lot of industry leaders in this space will give you a very finite list of items. You work through this process. At the end, you determine what your price is. I like to take a little more subjective view. I call it kind of my hippie self, where we talk about who we're serving and why we're serving them, and really build that into the conversation. So let's kick it off with history. Historically, and this conversation is really going to be for service-based industries today. I don't want to leave out my product sellers, but it is a very different set of facts that go into that, especially when you're considering inventory and everything. So this is really going to focus on my service-based people out there. And then maybe we'll do another one later for my product-based businesses. But when we look historically at how this has always been done, we've really taken the hours approach. I charge X number of dollars an hour, and that's my price, right? You say, well, I went to school, this is my background, this is my education, and then you justify in your mind why you're worth this dollar figure. So where that logic has always worked historically, it definitely was the gold standard of the generations before us. You think law firms, you think accounting firms, all of those, architectural services. Me as a consumer, when I walk into a lawyer's office and they say, hey, I charge $875 an hour, are you cool with that? First, I have to kind of get my demeanor back, because that's a lot. But the thing that's always struck me as hard within there is it never always came with an estimate of how long something was going to take. So me as a consumer, 3 hours, I probably can swallow that bill. But if it's 20 hours, that's a really big bill. And so there was a lot of uncertainty around that pricing model, right? So unless you were able to secure an estimate of time expected, your bill could literally be $800 or $8 million, depending on what you're doing. And that just caused a lot of anxiety. It caused a lot of cash flow problems when you finally receive that bill. And it was a hard way to plan, especially as a small business owner. We know that every dollar counts. And so we've seen in the last, 5 years where people are kind of moving away from that, because, you also have to think about, as a service-based provider, if you're charging hourly, you are keeping track of your hours. So billable time in my industry is a huge thing. How that factors into your administrative time, you're charging by the hour, but you also have to spend that extra time calculating all that, justifying all that, all of those kind of things. But another thing that has really come to light and made a lot of sense to me is, in your early state of your career, it may take you an hour to do something. So you're charging an hour to that client for that thing. But as you progress and as you get better, that hour that it used to take you may only take you 15 minutes now. So if you think about it from that perspective, if you're charging $100 an hour, in your early career, you were making $100 for that service. Now it only takes you 15 minutes. So now you're making less with more experience, and it's almost punishing you for being better at your job or putting things in that make things take less time, really utilizing technology or, support staff. So when we think about from that perspective, it doesn't make a lot of sense to bill hourly, unless that's really just all you can do and that's all you want to do. And then you can stop listening here, because it just doesn't fit where we're progressing. And so we've seen this big move to what we call value-based pricing. And so when I talk with my clients about, this is what I'm providing, this is the service, this is the outcome that's anticipated, my first question is, well, how much do you think that service is worth to the person that you're providing it to? So, say I obtain an EIN for someone, I get a tax identification number. Well, for me, I know how to do this because I've been doing this, but for somebody else, they may not know how to do this, and it could take them hours, and then they could do it wrong, and then they have to pay me to fix it. So, if I charge $500 for somebody to say, hey, I'm going to go obtain this information for you, I'm going to get this taken care of, it's probably worth that to them because they don't have the expertise to make that happen. And so if you look at it from that perspective, they are receiving this service, it's valued at X. It might take me 15 minutes, but it would take them 3 hours. So really starting to get comfortable with, I provide this and it's worth this, not because it takes me this much time, but because it frees up this much time for whoever I'm providing the service for. So really the first step that I think is, and the thing that I work through first is, what are you providing? What alternatives do they have? So are they able to not have as many subscriptions? Are they able to save extra time so they can be doing other things? Identify what your service or, what does it do, and how do you put a price tag on that? Not an hourly, it takes me to do this. No, it's how much value can you assign to that? And then, I had one this week where we talked about that. So this particular client has this really fun kind of membership service company in New York City. She throws all these beautiful events for her clients, and they network and they meet people and they do all these things. And so, we're talking about the ticket pricing, and then with her, there's some sponsorships that go into it as well. And she's like, well, the food for this event costs $15 a head. So I'm comfortable charging, $25 a head. And it's like, well, think about the value that your participants are receiving from these events. They're potentially making business connections, and they're networking, and they're doing all of these amazing things. And to me, it's probably worth more than $25, right? And so that's a hard place. It honestly is a hard place to start because we, especially as female entrepreneurs, we tend to devalue what we do and say, oh, well, they could just do this themselves, or, oh, they could just go to one of my competitors. And yeah, they totally could, but what makes you different? Identify that as part of this process. There are so many CPAs out there. I mean, not as many now because these youngsters don't want to do it, but there are so many CPAs to choose from. How do I identify, and what do I say and do and prove, and the experience that I give that sets me apart from my peers? All of us have those quirks. Everybody, not everybody fits with everybody. So how do I, as a professional in an industry that has a large number of options, how do I make someone want to stay with me? So that's how you would start that, right? These are the things that make me better. So for her, it's like, hers is a brunch event, which I can't wait for her to get merch. I'm so pumped. But she identifies that, we have these brand partnerships, and so we get all this exposure and we do all these things. So yeah, it may cost you $15 per person, but that's not where we start the conversation. We start the conversation with, what is the value of everything that's going into this for those different attendees? And so from there, it's a good start. And then when we talk about her, for a good example, I asked her to identify what is your ideal customer. What do they look like? Is it a they? Is it, she? Is it he? Is it everybody? What does that person look like? Are they a young professional? Are they in their college career still? What does their income band look like? What does that perfect avatar look like? And then really identifying the business that you're building based on that income band. Do those two things line up? So if we're talking about these posh nighttime booze cruise where we have champagne and we caviar, but you're telling me your target market is like third year college kids, I can tell you that as a third year college kid, I would have been lucky to hit like quarter draft night at the pub down the street. And that would have been just those things for me. And I'm sure there's outliers, but those things for me would not have lined up. So ensuring that your dream service that you're providing matches your dream avatar in a client also is important, because you can build the most beautiful business and you can price it how you think it's going to sell. But if you're targeting the wrong person, especially if you're targeting somebody who doesn't have the means as a whole group, your product or your service is going to go nowhere because you're not in alignment. Those things don't match up. And so that becomes frustrating because, well, it just sucks because you have this beautiful thing you're building. You want them to come, but you have a huge discrepancy in a major component of that. So, that's important. That's also always changing. We all progress through life in a different pace, different stages of our life, different exterior things are happening, right? We have COVID kind of threw a lot of people for a loop. Inflation's kind of tampering with everybody. So being flexible is also very important in this. And, a good example of that is I actually last night was speaking to a client who has, she runs a barn with all these beautiful horses. And in that business, there are a lot of fixed costs. There's a lot of costs you just can't get around. And during this last 6 months, even a year probably, we've seen crazy increases in the price of hay and grain and shavings that go on the floor and sand, all the things that we need to keep these horses alive and living their best life. And there's nothing she can do about those costs, right? So, we talked a lot about, well, you can absorb as a business some of those expenses, but then you're going to get to a point where you're no longer going to be able to do that. And you're actually charging less to the people who are boarding than it's costing you to keep that horse at the facility. So then you're losing money every month. And some business models can handle that if we think this is a short-term thing, but in the long run, you can't be operating at a loss. Like best case scenario, you're operating at a loss every single month. That just can't go on. And so we worked through last night how she's going to have to do a price increase to her boarders, people who keep their horse at her stable, and the guilt, and this is common, the guilt around raising prices is real, and people feel awful. I feel awful when I raise my prices. It's just not something that most of us are comfortable with. And so what I said to her was, well, consider the alternative. Say you don't raise your prices and say you continue to operate at a loss. How long can you sustain this? And she's like, well, for a little while. I said, and then what happens? She's like, well, I can't run my business anymore. And I said, so then what happens to your boarders? Well, they probably have to go somewhere else. And I was like, and what do you think the fees will be at another barn? She's like, well, probably in line with what market is. So probably substantially higher than mine because I've tried really hard not to pass these expenses through. I said, so we're going to talk about not raising your prices for the next couple of months because you feel awful doing that. And then at that point, you're going to have to close your doors. You're going to have to rehome all of these horses. They're going to have to go somewhere else. They're going to have to pay potentially substantially higher board. So what are we saving them by not raising their board for the next couple of months? She's like, well, I just feel bad. I was like, well, would you feel we're telling them that we have to increase because of X, Y, and Z, meaning your board went or your feed went up, your labor went up, all those things? Or would you rather tell them, hey, I made the choice not to raise your fees, and now I actually have to close my doors. So now I'm not in business anymore. And now you don't get to do the business you love. You have to go work for somebody else doing some office work or some crap that nobody wants to do. And she's like, well, I guess when you put it that way, I was like, well, right. Because no matter what, at the end of the day, we all still have to make a living, because you can't pay your rent or your mortgage on being a nice person. I mean, if we could do that, my mortgage would have been paid, I think, forever ago. So you have to keep that in mind. And that's kind of the next step of the process in my head is evaluate you as the person. So a good example of this, me, the person, Dawn, the person, my professional options are kind of as follows. I could not work, which doesn't help me financially at all. I could go back to a firm, which has a pretty specific, salary band. I could change industries altogether and shoot for the stars and see what happens there. Or I can work inside this business that I'm creating. And so I identify all those things. I identify the salary ranges that go along with all of my choices. So you would do this for yourself, right? If I were to stay in my job that I'm working now, this is how much money I'd make. Or if I'm to do my side hustle and make it my big one, my day-to-day, my everything, this is the salary that I would need to live comfortably, right? So identifying and making a budget for yourself. These are the things that I need covered. This is the very bare minimum of where we start, because quite frankly, none of us are in this to scrape by our whole life. So it's just a good process to make sure you're at least covering the major stuff. And then you build from there and you say, well, these are my inputs for the business. So for me, I have some technology costs. I have some, random things I have to pay for. I have a lot of continued education because, it's important to stay current in my field. I'm also just naturally very curious. And so I love taking all this random stuff. And so that gets added on there. And then we see, is this the quality of life we're looking for? Can we sustain at a very low level this lifestyle from this business based on, what the perceived pricing would be? And then once you've identified those things, then we identify the life we actually want to live, right? So I identify the things that are very important to me. These are the expenses that make my life comfortable, allow me to do the things that I want to do, allow me to do the things that make this whole nonsense worthwhile. And then we add those in. And then we kind of do an analysis of, do these things line up? If I charge X for my services, how many services do I need to sell to make it to this, right? So for me, for ease of math, so say I need $5,000 a month. That probably covers my oldest child. And my services are $500 a piece. How many services do I need to do a month to make that happen? And if I think from a time perspective, that is something that I can sustain, then that you're probably on the right track. If you tell me I'm making $4 on every single one of my services that I'm providing, and I need to do 12 million services a year to sustain whatever I've built, I think we need to have a conversation about the reality of what you're doing and the realisticness of, I don't know if that's a word, how are you going to make it? And are you going to make it long term? And I've talked about it before, listen, we can hustle hard and we can hustle hard for a while, but do you want to hustle hard your entire life? So consider that, right? I mean, there's going to be a part in your day or in your year or somewhere in your career where you're like, I can't do this anymore. And then what's the point there, right? So really being realistic about, this is the lifestyle that I'm looking to build. And obviously these are, high level hopes and dreams, but it's really important. It's important to not undervalue yourself to where you're working so hard, you have no free time at all, but you're not charging appropriate amounts. and you're not being compensated for the work you're doing or for the value that you're providing for the people that you're working with. So definitely a consideration there. And also a good exercise just to identify your fixed costs in your business and your fixed costs in your personal life and get an idea of what those look like, because you could have the best business ever, but if there's not enough money coming in and there's no way of enough money ever coming in, then there needs to be some adjustments that need to be taken into account. And also, if you think that eventually you'll need staff, that's something that you need to consider. So one thing that I do personally is when I first started my company, I really, really, really wanted to help everybody. I thought that everyone who came to me, I felt obligated to help. That's just my nature. I don't know why. But I was finding that there were people that were coming to me that were like, I can only pay you, $100, which was like a fraction of what I should be charging. And that $100 client, while grateful, also took up, the time of 4 clients because they had so many questions. And so I was finding that I was giving away a lot of my time and I wasn't being compensated appropriately. And so then I was finding that my demeanor was changing towards it. I wasn't my spunky self, if you will. And I was becoming really frustrated. And the more of these clients that I was like, I have to help them. Who else is going to help them? And it got so bad. My husband actually sat me down and asked if I was running a not-for-profit. And it's a conversation that I was really pissed about while we were having it. I mean, like pissed. But then I took a step back and I realized that he was right. I was spending all this time and I wasn't being compensated for it. I was missing out on things with my family because I felt the need to help all these other people. And I was losing sight of my whole self, my whole body, my whole ethos. And so I took a step back and said, what is the minimum, price of entry minimum that I am comfortable charging for each one of my services? And I created this document and I update it every year. And when someone inquires about my pricing, that's the very first thing I send to them because it gives them an idea of where my fees start. And if that is wildly out of the range of what they're comfortable with, I don't take the time to get to know them, to start that whole I feel bad, I want to help you process, because that's still very strong in me. And this is a safeguard that I've come up with to protect myself against that, because I still don't have a good handle on that. And so this is, if I send that to them and they're like, oh, totally out of my price range, I say, I wish you the very best. And I'm here when you're ready, but this is what I've determined is the very minimum cost to get into my practice. And it also helps me stand firm on my prices, because a lot of times people are like, oh, you're going to charge me $5,000 for that. Oh, will you do it for $3,500? And that's not cool either, right? We don't need that. So it helps a solid, even if it is just a PDF document that I send over, I'm like, sorry, man, my prices start at X. My prices start at $5,000. I can keep you close to that 5,000, maybe 5,500, but at no instance do I go under that. Now, I will tell you that by doing that and charging what I'm worth, it does allow me on those occasions when someone comes to me and either I feel very compelled to help them, or I know that my help would really just transition them into something beautiful, I do have the ability to lower my prices for that person for a set number of time, because I'm charging what I'm worth everywhere else. And I do that. I do it every year. There's a couple clients that I feel very passionate about for whatever reason, and I am able to help them, but I keep it to a small amount, and I have to justify it to not only myself, but I have employees that I have to verbalize it to. And And so that works for me because I'm charging, and I'm not worried because I'm charging my worth 99% of the time. I am able to do those projects that, kind of fill my soul of, I need to help everybody. So that's a consideration. That's a safeguard that I've put into place after I've identified, my fees and my costs and the lifestyle. One other thing we look at is what our competitors charge. So this is a starting place. I'm not a huge fan of I personally will never be the lowest person that you'll ever find. It's not the market I'm looking for. Usually the lower the price, the higher the number of transactions you need. And that's not a model that I'm looking to sustain. It may be a model that works best for your business, but it's not the one that I've chosen. And so every year the AICPA or whoever publishes kind of a range of fees in the different areas. And I take that into consideration when I'm doing my pricing. I never want to be, like I said, I never want to be super low, but I also have identified that the market that I'm trying to serve, creatives and female founders, small businesses, can't always sustain the maximum fees that are kind of in the ethos of what I could charge based on my experience. But I've identified my ideal avatar, and I keep my prices in a range that works for the people that I'm trying to serve. I never want to outprice my services from the market that I wish to be a part of. So that for me is a huge consideration. I could charge $12,000 for something, but nobody that I want to work with or enjoy working with, or very few of them, are going to be able to afford that level of commitment. And so that's a personal choice that I've made when I do this analysis. Good example, in this last tax year, I actually didn't raise any of my prices. And I'm sure a lot of people have opinions about that. But my logic was twofold. It was my fixed costs didn't go up. So I didn't have the cost of inflation, or my inputs weren't increasing. And so I didn't need to do an increase to cover there. And I felt that the market that I serve and that I'm so passionate about could not field that increase. And it would hurt people. And I made the personal choice that I was not going to raise my fees last year just because everything else around me was crashing down. And it, I'm sure there's pros and cons to that, right? I mean, long term, that's a skip of a year. That's, a setback as far as fees. But for me, I felt in my heart that was the right thing to do. And money wasn't obviously the driver in that choice. And so that was something that I did. And so this year, as I'm sitting down to increase my prices for next year, there will be an increase. I take into account things like inflation, right? Inflation is going nuts, and the costs of my staff are going up because I have to pay them more. And so having that conversation with yourself and knowing your costs helps you make those determinations, because there's always going to be a couple people who are mad that you're raising your fees. And, maybe you're no longer a good fit for those people. And that's hard to swallow sometimes, but I use the analysis of, I look at my children who are amazing, and I say to myself, every time I take on work, I'm potentially taking time away from my children. So is the financial gain that I'm receiving from taking on these clients, or the heart feelings that I'm taking on, is it worth not being there with my children for X number of hours? And that is kind of the barometer that I use in that sense to justify in my mind that this is something worth taking on. And so if someone pushes back and says, well, I don't like your costs, then I say, there's a lot of other qualified CPAs that might be a better fit, and I'm happy to help you find one, but you don't fit into the ethos of my practice. So pricing is one of those things that's never going to be easy. And at the end of the day, the things that are so important are ensuring that you're meeting your ideal avatar, identify that person or that company, or who are you serving? What do they look like? What do they like to do? Where do they hang out? What does their income look like? Does it support the business that you're building? And then once you've identified that, the services that you're providing your ideal avatar, are those enough to keep you operating as a happy person? I mean, listen, 90% of the time, right? There's going to be hard times, but are the fees that you're charging your customers enough for you to live the lifestyle that you want to live comfortably? Maybe you want a private jet. You should evaluate your fees there. But do they line up? We all have different lifestyles. I joke all the time that a crap load of money to me is totally different than a crap load of money to someone else. So it's a very personal decision in my mind. Do those things align? Is what you're building sustainable? Are you building a business where you have to hustle 7 days a week just to make ends meet? How long can you reasonably do that for? Do you have a plan to get out of that, or is this your plan? And if this is your plan, then maybe reevaluating if there's maybe auxiliary services that you can add on, if there's some sort of membership or recurring income that would help buffer that. Same thing with seasonal businesses. Is it feast or famine for you? Tax season for me is pretty lucrative. The rest of the year is based on more subscription type stuff, at least through after extensions are over, to kind of help annualize that, especially if you have employees. You don't want to be dealing with that kind of mess. So I really evaluate a lot of heartfelt evaluation in my pricing, which is very different than a lot of my peers, and I will openly admit that. But for me, at the end of the day, that's something that's very important to me in my business, and that might be something that's very important to you in your business. And so adding that extra step of evaluating your avatar, can you provide what you need? And reevaluate this every 6 months or so, because it sucks to give price increases to your customers, and none of us like to do it. None of us as customers like to hear it, but the alternative of you going out of business, that really sucks. So if you approach it that way, then you're probably going to lose some clients, and that sucks, but you're probably going to get some new ones. And especially, with that client that has the service-based, like brunches and things, what I mentioned to her was, are all of your events sold out? Well, yes. Do you have a wait list? Yes. You need to be charging more, because clearly the market is there. Clearly the demand is there. The income is there. All of those things are there. You need to get out of your own way and adjust your pricing, because clearly you have that opportunity. So none of us like to talk about money except for me. But it's important. And if you can't sustain your family or yourself or your dog, you gotta make choices. And again, the alternative is going out of business or struggling every day. So when you put it in that perspective, I think you'll make the right choice. So lots of information, super sketch. There's no right answer. Listen, some people have an equation, you can throw it in there. But it takes all the emotion out of it. And I don't like to live like that. So, as always, I'm always here for questions and comments, and I love it when you guys reach out. So if you want some follow-up on all of this, reach out, let me know. But as always, thank you so much for joining me today. You can find us on Spotify, Apple, or anywhere else you enjoy your shows.